Good afternoon. Welcome to today's episode of The Coal Scene. I'm Chris Hamilton. I'll be your host over the next half hour. Joining me in the studio this afternoon is Jason Bostic, Vice President, West Virginia Coal Association. Jason and I will be talking a little bit about some current affairs within the industry. We'll provide an update of some of the state's production and employment levels. And we're going to focus in more detail about our metallurgical coal operations, predominantly in the southern part of the state, although we have a few in north central as well. And for those of you that are unaware, met coal or metallurgical coal is the coal that is typically primed for coking and steel manufacturing. It just so happens that we have some of the finest, highest quality met coal seams here in the state of West Virginia than you'll find anywhere else in the world. So we're very proud of that, and we certainly have a niche in our world markets with respect to our met coal production here. So Jason, hey, thanks for coming by and appreciate you taking time to join us here this afternoon.
Sure, just glad to be here.
Seems like there's a little bit of an uptick. There's some renewed optimism within the industry right now. I know we've put a few miners back to work. We've opened a couple new mining operations, a little bit of an increase in coal production. So generally speaking, things seem to be on, trending in the right way and right direction. And, everybody seems to be fairly optimistic right now.
Overall, better attitude in the entire industry. So I think a lot of that has to do with the national election and an administration that will at least acknowledge the concerns of the coal industry and recognizes that coal is such an important part of the nation's electricity fuel mix. But more importantly, with respect to West Virginia, to have a president that's encouraged and enthused about manufacturing steel in this country. And what I refer to as the hard manufacturing, the hard economy where you actually make things. I think that's kind of reinvigorated some of the metallurgical coal production here in West Virginia. And we have in the country nationally, for the first time, our domestic steel producers announcing expansion plans and rehabilitation plans for some of their larger infrastructure, like their blast furnaces and their coke ovens. And it's been a long time since we've had that kind of good news, not only in America, but here in West Virginia.
You know, the good changes that we're seeing today are, they're relatively small, but the significance is so grand. Given 7 or 8 years of austerity and companies in bankruptcy and the downturn in the industry and the loss of markets, the closure of power plants, it really seems as if the industry here has, the movement downward has ceased and we've plateaued. We've weathered a couple major storms. And things, again, are going in the right direction.
Yeah, we think so. The signs that we see tell us that the steam market, the electricity or thermal coal market, has at least stabilized. Improvement in that market will take a long time. You can't turn on power plants that were turned off during the previous federal administration because of Clean Air Act restrictions. But if we don't have any more loss of steam coal or thermal coal production, then we can at least hold the line. Now with metallurgical coal and industrial coal production, we've actually seen an uptick. Mines in West Virginia, most of them being in southern West Virginia, like you said earlier, mines that were deactivated during the previous 8 years, during the economic crisis, if you will, are being reactivated. And we've got plans from major coal companies, which include companies that are owned by some of the world's largest steel makers, of reactivating those mines or adding new infrastructure. So it's very encouraging.
You know, when we saw a decrease in domestic consumption began to take its toll 3-4 years ago, about that time, because of some very unfortunate situations in some of our state's major competitor countries like Australia, it seems like the foreign market opened up a little bit. I think we hit record exports 2011, 2012, maybe even doubled our country's export volumes. And I think that served to skew in a positive way the real losses that were taking place here domestically.
Yes, the problems in Australia, as you know, Chris, Australia is the world's largest metallurgical coal producer. The United States of America used to be, and Appalachia and West Virginia was a primary component of that metallurgical production. Australia is the world's biggest met producer. And when they have shipping interruptions or production interruptions, it really does send shockwaves through the market. And Australia went through a period of difficulty from weather events in that 2010-2012 time frame.
They have typhoons there, if I'm not mistaken.
They do. Their infrastructure is very susceptible to weather events off the coast. And of course, the rail lines and the export shipping ports are much more susceptible to weather damage than I think our ports are here in West Virginia or in this country. So you've got that issue. So they are subject to severe interruption. And every time that happens, metallurgical coal is such a finite resource in the world that it sends the markets into shockwave. And I think the chart that your audience has in front of you now kind of shows and reflects those spikes in the metallurgical market. And the first spike was in that time frame, the first weather disruption that Australia had. The second major spike, which is what we're currently in the middle of right now, is the reflects the interruptions from the latest cyclone in Australia.
Which is underway at the current time.
It is.
Or just recently subsided.
Yes, and the coal producers and the transportation companies are in the process of rebuilding their damaged infrastructure. So the chart that was up on the screen earlier showed a green trend line and what we forecast to be the metallurgical pricing going forward through the remainder of this year, and it's going to start to come back down. But even for us here in West Virginia, we think it's going to be a price that is sustainable for the southern West Virginia producers. That if it doesn't drop below that benchmark, that we can still continue to mine and produce coal, maybe even expand some metallurgical coal mines.
You know, back when we went through the oil embargo days of the mid-'70s, you know, when the nation had these long lines at the gas stations and at the pumps, everything was controlled, you know, by Saudi Arabia at the time. And, you know, I recall that you know, the price of coal spiked during the mid-late 70s. And then remarkably, it went on a downward spiral for the next 20 years. And the industry survived. But, you know, it went from selling coal to $60 and $70 a ton down to $22 a ton over a 20-year period. Never did spike back up during a 20-year period.
Yes. It was the same issue here. The other thing with respect to the metallurgical coal market in West Virginia to keep in mind is the thermal coal, electrical demand for steam coal is relatively stable. You know, the power generation swings, but it's not nearly as erratic as metallurgical coal. Met coal production, of course, is tied to the world economy and the manufacturing of steel and other industrial goods. So things like consumer demand and international unrest and the behavior of the Chinese economy has so much to do with met coal. So that's why when you see met coal pricing trends, one thing to keep in mind are the severe, what we call the peaks and the valleys. And the trick we have to learn here in West Virginia as coal producers, and the state has to understand with respect to fiscal policy, is that the metallurgical coal market is tied to the world economy. And if the world economy is doing well and steel demand is high, then metallurgical coal will be high. But those spikes and peaks don't last very long. So the trick as coal producers is how do we stay in business through the peaks and the valleys? And one of the things West Virginia needs to keep in mind as it shapes its fiscal policy is the prices that you see today with respect to metallurgical coal may not be the prices that you're going to see in a short, as quickly as 6 months or 3 months from now. They can go up. Most likely in the current environment, they're going to go back down. And even though it'll still be sustainable, not at the high levels that have been reflected because of the weather events in Australia.
You know, one thing you mentioned is the fact that, you know, we don't totally control our own destiny here in West Virginia because we don't use all the coal that we mine or have the potential of mining. You know, I think we use about a third. You know, I think maybe the best way to illustrate that is that, you know, divide our coal production into thirds. we mine a third and consume it here within the boundaries of West Virginia. We mine a second third and we send it domestically to 20-some states east of the Mississippi River. And then we mine a third that is on the export market. And we don't control 2/3 of that volume that we produce. We're very much vulnerable to world events, political unrest, severe weather events that occurs. I know when we saw a big drop in the China economy, and their annual growth rate was running in double digits for the biggest part of a decade. Then all of a sudden they dropped in half to 6 and 7% with respect to their gross national product. And all of a sudden they stopped importing coal and fuel and raw materials from around the world.
Yes.
So everybody ramps up their production to meet their needs of today, and then they decide that they're going to either quit producing steel or quit building as they've done over the past decade or so, and it impacts a lot of industries around the world.
Absolutely. And metallurgical coal is a great example of that. And it's even complicated even further, more complicated than the steam coal consumption or steam coal production is, because of the interplays within the world economy. Mm-hmm. We all know that China's the biggest player, not only in the consumption of coal, but in the production of steel. Australia is the largest metallurgical coal producer, and being in Asia, in China's back door almost, mm-hmm. or right adjacent to mainland China, it supplies the bulk of that demand. But depending on events in Europe, for example, we would have to change the blends of metallurgical coal that we send to the steel producers in Europe or the steel producers in Canada. For the most part, our domestic blends to the producers here in this country stay relatively stable.
They do.
But they too are subject to the fluctuations of the world economy mm-hmm. and their demand for steel.
Say we export a third of the coal that we mine, all that became very vulnerable under the proposed clean power plan, that was just nixed by this president and his administration.
Yes, because as much as important as coal production, steam coal production mm-hmm. would be to West Virginia, take a large coal consuming state like North Carolina. We obviously here in West Virginia in our structure of state government have no control over what they choose to do with their power grid and their power producers. And the Clean Power Plan was going to drastically alter that.
We're bouncing around a little bit, but if I recall, every state was going to develop its own energy and state implementation plan based on the requirements under the Clean Power Plan, at least as it was proposed or initially implemented.
Yes.
And which meant that West Virginia coal was probably very vulnerable. When they had to cut out fossil fuels and carbon agents, for base fuel and electricity production, it was likely that West Virginia coal was going to be, pretty close to the first to go.
Yeah, I'm afraid it was. And the coal-dependent states like, West Virginia itself and our electric utilities mm-hmm. here within the state, but the traditional markets for our coal would have been severely impacted. North Carolina, Pennsylvania, some of the surrounding eastern states that we typically ship to, that had already taken a hit under the mercury control regulations, mm-hmm. which led to the closure of about 600 power plants, 2008 to about 2013-14.
That's amazing. I'm not sure people really understand how that impacts I'm sure they understand how it impacts the coal industry when they hear that, but the magnitude of those closures and the effect it's had on coal markets. Yes. And we have such a smaller marketplace today for our coal products than what we've ever had.
We absolutely do. Unfortunately, most of those closures, Chris, as you know from the mercury control mm-hmm. regulations, directly targeted the plants that burned West Virginia coal. Mm-hmm. And a disproportionate number of those plants burned thermal coal from southern West Virginia. So that we have lost virtually the entire market for thermal coal from southern West Virginia. Northern West Virginia went through a similar reduction, but as coal properties and as coal infrastructure goes, it was better situated. The plants it supplied were better situated to absorb the impacts of that regulation than the plants that were supplied by southern West Virginia coal.
You've outlined some of the challenges that West Virginia coal has globally, but on one hand we have some of the finest grade coal, particularly for steel production, that you'll find anywhere in the world. But there's also this fierce competitiveness that we find ourselves in on the international market as well. You know, there are countries that have maybe not quite as good as met coal, but they have a level of met coal that makes for pretty good steel production, and their mining costs are less, their transportation costs are less, and so it makes it pretty tough for American or West Virginian producers.
It absolutely does. I mean, we've talked about Australia several times since we're talking about met coal. You know, if there is a class of coal in the world that comes close to the quality of West Virginia's metallurgical coal, it's Australia. But those coal seams are, you know, 3 and 4, 6, 7, 8 feet thick, and they're surface mineable coal seams in Australia. Most of the metallurgical coal in West Virginia is underground mine, and it's typically underground mine in thinner seams.
Thinner seams, and it's also remnant seams. You know, just as you go and buy and purchase remnant sections of carpet, you know, not to undervalue it, but the fact is you don't have large contiguous reserves that lend themselves for long walling and some of the more productive methods.
That's exactly right. I mean, the first 150 years of the Industrial Revolution in North America and 2 world wars were fueled by West Virginia's metallurgical coal. So the biggest, easiest reserves of met coal have already been exhausted. They were exhausted as we were building the great country that we know now and defending the world from tyranny. So we are left with these smaller pieces that are harder to get to and more expensive to get to. And at the same time, we're trying to compete with metallurgical coal in Australia that's surface mined, and it's right next door to the major consuming market of Asia. So we do have a tougher time here in West Virginia to compete.
Higher cost, tougher mining methods and geological conditions, and certainly a little more transportation costs. In fact, probably a lot more transportation. And then a lot of instances today, you're working against the strength of the dollar.
Yes. Yeah, the financial world plays into this, but transportation, as you mentioned that, most of the metallurgical production in West Virginia is depending on rail transportation. And not to take anything away from rail transportation per se, but you really don't have the option to load, because of its location in the state, to load this coal on a truck to get it to a river port for export on a barge. And you obviously don't have deep water ports in West Virginia. But the rail transportation is something we absolutely have to think about.
We generally say we distinguish steam coal from met coal or vice versa, but there's a number of grades of met coal as well.
There is. Met coal is almost a science in and of itself. It's generally classified according to its volatile matter, and what that means is how much material in the coal would burn if you were to light it off with a flame. And that's important because to make steel out of coal, it has to be coked first. Not coke that you get out of the refrigerator, but a different product that is manufactured for the steel industry that is almost pure carbon. And among the 3 general grades of metallurgical coal, high vol, low vol, and mid vol coal, you can also split those out about another 18 or 20 different ways, depending on the particular chemical composition of those coals. And that's important to the individual steel manufacturing process that the coke is made for. I like to say that metallurgical coal is almost prescription blended for the blast furnace and the coke ovens that it's headed to, because each individual set of ovens has its own set of factors that have to be taken into account. If any one of those properties or constituents of met coal is inconsistent with the way the coke oven is designed, then it can do severe damage to the steel plant's infrastructure. So it's pretty important that coal is on spec exactly the way the steel company wants it to make the product.
Are there examples where met coal is used for steam combustion and steam's used for met?
Not nearly as much as there used to be.
Okay.
Metallurgical coal, the properties of met coal don't lend itself well to use in the boiler, in an industrial boiler to make steam or to make heat, because met coal tends to, instead of burn completely, met coal tends to melt. And it can create what's called clinkers that can damage a boiler. And the same can be said for metallurgical coal. Thermal coal tends to ash out if you will, burn completely, whereas the met producer is looking for this coke conversion. There is one crossover category that's called PCI coal, which stands for pulverized coal injection. And that's used in the blast furnace not to act as an oxygen reducing agent or to infuse the iron with carbon. It's used purely to make heat. So you have this particular blend of what would otherwise be steam coal that can be blown into the blast furnace to create the heat that helps meet the charge of iron ore and coke to ultimately make raw iron. But that's usually the only crossover coal, as we call it, is the PCI coal. And that's been a relatively recent technological development over the last 25 years.
You know, the one thing just occurred to me, while there may be some substitutes for coal when it comes to generating electricity, you know, such as natural gas, your renewables, solar, wind, etc. Are there any alternatives here that can be used to produce steel?
Not really. There is a process called direct iron reduction that can be used in the steel making process. But to replace entirely coke as a fuel in the steel making process, either at the blast furnace stage where iron ore is converted to raw iron, or even later at the steel furnace stage where iron is converted to steel, I think you're always going to have a constituent of a coking or metallurgical coal constituent of that process. Because steel without carbon is
I think there's a slide that's on the screen that talks about the steel, the coking process.
Yes.
Can you describe that a little bit?
Well, obviously, you start out where metallurgical coal is delivered to the coke oven. And when you think of a coke oven, just think of the oven in your kitchen. You take this coal that's particularly blended a certain way, you put it in the oven and you cook it, heat it in the absence of oxygen. So you cook the coal without burning it.
Without burning it.
And in the process of heating the coal, you drive off these volatile elements and all these other constituents that ultimately go through a refining process and become any number of carbon-based chemicals. It can be used to make plastics, medication, just about anything you can think of can come out of the chemical stream. But after the coal's cooked in the oven, it comes out red hot. Again, it hasn't been burned, but it's been cooked. And in that process, coal, it melts, then it re-solidifies. And the product that's left over is a solid lump. It would otherwise look like a lump of coal, but it's gray and it's very porous. So after the coke is taken from the oven, then it's taken to the blast furnace, where it's added along with the iron ore and limestone to make the blast furnace charge. In the blast furnace, the iron ore is heated, the coke starts to burn. The blast furnace is true to its name. It's fed by a pure stream of oxygen and gets to very, very high temperatures, where it starts to melt the iron, starts to burn the coke, which melts the iron ore. The iron ore comes out as liquid iron, is tapped from the blast furnace, and then added to the steel furnace. The limestone in the blast, I skipped a process. The limestone is added to the blast furnace is what's called a fluxing agent. It takes steel slag and the impurities out of the iron ore bind to the limestone and become the byproduct of the blast furnace. It's called steel slag. But after the metal in the blast furnace reaches a certain temperature, the furnace is tapped. And then that raw iron, molten iron, is then taken to a steel furnace, where it goes through another refining process, where scrap metal can be added to the steel furnace charge. Some more coke is added to infuse the steel with strength. Carbon adds strength to the steel. And then it goes through another refining process. There's another steel slag stream that comes off the steel furnace. And from the steel furnaces, it goes to what we call the finishing mills, where it's rolled or shaped, and ultimately comes your washing machine, your car frame, or anything else you can think of that's made of steel.
How much steel are we producing here in the country now?
Drastically reduced over the years, but again, a lot like with the coal industry. We think what's left is sustainable. In the 70s and 80s, this country's steel market went through a really tough time. We were left, we had, coming out of the Second World War, furnaces, the Second World War and the economic boom that followed that in the 50s. We were left with blast furnaces and infrastructure that were very old and very tired. And other countries, primarily at that time, Germany and Japan, were coming back online with much newer technology, which created a real problem here in this country for our steel furnaces. Went through a lot of retirements, a lot of consolidations, a lot of bankruptcies in the domestic steel industry. I think at one point, every steel producer in America but one was in bankruptcy. We've come through that. I think we as